All right, so welcome to our shir on Mor Nevuchim. I think this is lecture number 67, I think. And we are now in part 2 of the Mor Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, chapter 19. And we had mentioned the uh, we had started last week. We had started the chapter 19. We just read a little bit, and we mentioned then, and we discussed the importance of why it's so important to Rambam, and what's the difference between whether or not the world is eternal, as Aristotle said, and versus whether or not the world was created. Now, and Rambam gave a very important, introduced a very important idea, and that is that if the world has always been right, regardless of whether or not you use what Aristotle felt that there was a God that made everything go, but that God was always doing the same exact thing for eternity and always will for eternity. Or was there a moment in time where God decided to create the world, where there was nothing, and then after it, something? So, sorry, my cat keeps trying to jump on my lap, and it makes it hard for me to teach. So the important thing is that if the world was created by a supreme being, or whatever term you want to refer to God as, and then there's a purpose, right? The God did it for a reason, right? We don't know what that reason is, or we may not be able to know, or we may be able to try to figure out, but it introduces the concept of a purpose, of a reason, right? If everything is the way it is because that's the way it is, in other words, there's scientific rules that guide the nature of reality. Those rules have always applied, and because of those rules, everything is exactly how it is, and therefore everything always was and always will be. So then there's no purpose, right? There's no point to it all, right? It just is. Why? Because it is, right? So, and Rambam introduced that idea. Now, so the relationship between Yesh Me'ayin and the idea of a purpose to the world, and that God creating the world for a reason, is really central to this argument between Rambam and Aristotle. And frankly, this argument is exactly the same, right, as the argument that still continues to this day, right? And that is because in this chapter that we're going to study this week, chapter 19, it's going to be very long, and I can't help it. I promise we're just going to keep going straight through, no matter how difficult and long it might be. And there's going to be a lot of concepts and ideas that are drawn from Aristotelian astronomy, in this case of this part of this paragraph, this chapter. But so at many points it might start sounding to us really weird, because this is stuff we're way different nowadays understanding than Aristotle. But the basic concept is really the same, because if you look at the world and you say like this, there's a bunch of scientific rules that guide the way everything is, right? And those are the rules of physics, chemistry, biology, whatever. And because of all of those rules, and those are all based ultimately on the nature of matter and atoms and molecules, and then the nowadays we know about the subatomic particles, quarks and whatever, and but because of the nature of how these things work, and the various laws that govern the way they work, that's why everything is the way it is. It has to be that way because those are the rules, right? So that's that. Or do you say that yes, these are the rules that govern the world, but there was a moment when none of those rules existed and anything could have happened, but there was a being, we'll call him the God, who decided to put these rules into play. There's another and make the world the way it is. And why did he pick these rules? Because he had a reason to do it. And ultimately, what we're going to learn as we go through the Rambam is what's the reason. Well, we're never going to get to know the reason with the capital T, but the reason with the small t, we're going to explain, is in order for there to be people on the world who fulfill God's purpose, who keep God's Torah, who live the kind of life and lead the kind of lives that God wants us to lead. Right? Ultimately, we're not going to get there in this paragraph, but ultimately that's where we're going to go. So now that we have that idea, right? I want to recommend there is a really good podcast called From Physics to God, um, that I highly recommend. It's another some people took my advice and listened to the podcast that I suggested last week. So this is another one I'm suggesting. If people want to know the link, I could send it out after the lecture. But also discussing this idea. But anyway, let's go. I'm in the middle of the small chapter in the middle of page 303 in the Pines. So basically, he goes in a quick mention of impossibility, right? Of the nature of impossibility. Now, Rambam doesn't go into this in length here. On that podcast that I referred to last week, you can listen to the idea of can God do something that's impossible, right? And that question starts to create a whole bunch of mental gymnastics and confusing situations. But the bottom line is that Rambam is of the opinion that the nature of impossibility cannot be abolished. So something that's impossible is impossible, as we shall make clear later in part 3, chapter 15, and we'll get to there. So he just made a side mention, which is why I went off on that tangent last week. But now I'm going to go on to as follows, the next chapter. And I might, in some of these chapters, run through them a little quickly because they're kind of long, but let's work through them. My purpose in this chapter is to explain to you by means of argument. Now, this sentence is a really, really crucial sentence. By means of arguments that come close to being a demonstration. In the Rambam's terminology and the way Pines translates, the word demonstration refers to a proof, right? A proof means it is that way. The Rambam has so far always been using, and Pines has been translating it this way. When he uses the word demonstration, Rambam means it's something that is a fact, right? It's a proof. It's been scientifically proven. It is what it is, right? And the Rambam is making it clear, right, that I'm going to make close to you by means of arguments that come close to being a demonstration. In other words, all of my proofs, which I'm going to prove in a minute, right, that what exists indicates to us of necessity that it exists in virtue of the purpose of one who purposed. In other words, that the entire world, the entire universe exists because God had a purpose for it. And he therefore purposed it, meaning for this I'm creating this world in order to achieve a certain outcome. This, by the way, is what we call, it's in the language of religious philosophy, this is called the teleological argument for God. In other words, God wanted a world with a certain result, right? We look around us and we see a world in which A, B, C, D, E, F, G is all happening. We see all this stuff happening. So clearly, someone, God, created the world in order to achieve that result. The world could have been in an infinite number of other ways, but it isn't. It's like the way we see it. So therefore, it must be that God chose it to be this way. That's the teleological argument in a nutshell. I'm not saying whether it's a good argument or a bad argument, but Rambam is making that argument, and he's saying, he's not exactly making that argument here, but he's referencing it, right? But I'm telling you that what exists indicates to us. In other words, when we look at the world that exists, it indicates to us that it exists because God had a purpose for it, right? But remember what he said, it comes close to being a demonstration. This is Rambam admitting up front, and be aware that I know, Rambam says, I know that I will not prove it to you. This came up last week and the week before, right? Rambam is making it extremely clear that these proofs are going to come close to a proof, but there's always going to be an out, right? You're always going to be to disprove me, right? So you're going to say that it's not 100%. So, and to do this without, and then he says, if you remember at the end of book 1, the Rambam brought the arguments of the Mutakalamun. And the Mutakalamun believed in the theory of the atomists, which goes way back to the Greek times. And the atomists believed that everything can break down into tiny little particles, and all those tiny little particles are identical. And the world is constantly being broken down and put back together by these tiny little particles. And the nature of these particles, when they when they all get back together in a different way, they become a new thing with new characteristics. And we went into it in detail then, and I'm not going to go into in detail now, right? But that was there. But they used that whole philosophy in order to prove that God exists. And then Rambam brought those proofs, and then Rambam said that I don't like those proofs, and he disproved them, right? So I'm not going to go that. I'm skipping a few sentences. And if you look about 8 or 9 lines down, Rambam writes a sentence, do not think that they have also said what I shall say, right? right? They're not saying the same thing that I am. So if you think that I'm going to try to use their proofs, right? And I'm not. I'm using a different set of proofs. I'm using my own. On the other hand, there is no doubt that they wished what I wish. The result, in other words, they were trying to prove that there was a creation and there's a creator. I'm trying to prove the same thing. So here's Rambam saying that I and these Islamic philosophers are ultimately trying to prove the same thing, but I don't agree with their methods. I'm telling you my own method of proving it. They also have mentioned the same things that I shall mention and observed in them particularization. And many of the things that I'm going to look at and discuss, I refer to this particularization. What is particularization? Particularization means that everything, every object or creature or whatever in this world has a specific qualities about it that make it different from the next one, right? So you and I, we're both people. Well, one of us is taller, one of us is shorter, one of us is lighter, one of us is darker, one of us is male, one of us is female. So there's differences that make me different from you, right? Or more extreme, there's differences that make me different from this cat who can't stop jumping on my lap, right? So we're different in certain things, right? So so and in their opinion, there's so they established their particularization. I'm kind of skipping till the end of the page. I'm going to turn the page, and they explain particularization by talking about how do these atoms get together. I'm on top of 304 now. I skipped a bunch, but I shall explain, and I'm also going to discuss the idea of particularization about why one thing is different from another. But I'm not going to deal with the atom business. The Rambam didn't like that whole the whole business of atoms. Okay, fine. I shall explain this method after first setting forth this premise. In every case in which things differing in any way from one another possesses a common matter, all right? Think about it for a minute, right? If I'm different from you, but we're both made of the same stuff, right? There must of necessity be a cause other than the matter that rendered it necessary for me to be me and you to be you, right? That some of the things have a certain attribute, some have a different one, right? Why am I, X inches tall and you X inches tall if we're both made out of skin and bones and flesh or whatever, right? There's something that makes it that I'm different from you, even though we're made of the same stuff. Or there may be several causes according to the number of things. I might be taller, I might be shorter. You might be bigger, you might be smaller. You might be lighter, you might be darker. There might be a cause for one difference, another cause for another difference. But there's something that makes us different, even though we're made of the same stuff. This premise is unanimously agreed upon by those who believe in the eternity of the world and those who believe in its coming time. Whether me or Aristotle, no matter how you think the world was created, this has to be true, right? If we're made of the same stuff, something caused me and you to be different. So after I set this forth, this premise, I'm going to start to explain by means of questions and answers concerning Aristotle's opinion. So now the Rambam is going to present as if he's asking questions to Aristotle, right? He's going to pose a question, Aristotle, blah, 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 right? And then Aristotle's going to answer, which it's just actually Rambam going to be answering based on Rambam's understanding of Aristotle's writings. So we put a question to Aristotle as follows. You have demonstrated to us that the matter of everything that is beneath the sphere of the moon is one and common to everything, right? What then is the cause of the differences between the individuals of every species, right? If everything beneath the moon, right, in other words, everything that we see on this planet, right, is all created out of the same matter, right? So then why are there humans and lions, right? Why aren't we all the same, right? Okay, that's the question. Why are humans and trees and flowers and bees and fish different, right? What's going on? So obviously this is pre-Darwinian days, so that Aristotle's answer isn't going to be Darwin's answer, but he'll give his own answer. He'll say the cause of the differences lies in the changes in the mixture of the compounds composed of this matter, right? So there is one basic matter, right? But the matter becomes four forms, which we learned all the time is earth, fire, water, and wind, right? And because the mixture of those compounds is different in each item, right? I'm skipping through, I'm paraphrasing a little. For these elements were first mixed through the action of the motions of the sphere. The lowest sphere moving around causes all these things to mix around. And one of the main demonstrations of this that they saw with their own eyes is the moon moving and the tides going in and out. So mixing the water and the land and the earth and so on. and the wind blowing fire. They saw all these things mixing around. Okay, so consequently, the difference in the compounds representing a mixture of the elements came about through differing measures. If there's a little more warmth, a little more cold, a little more wet, a little more dry, in virtue of these combinations, right? These forms, they became disposed to receive other forms, and this continues constantly like this. So, depending on where they are in the world, the latitude, and then Aristotle will explain those whole things. So the bottom line is, he's going to tell you that the reason why they're different is because if you mix it in such a manner, then you get a person. If you mix it in this manner, you get a lion. If you mix it in this way, you get a mosquito. Okay. So now let me ask Aristotle another question. Rambam says, I'm at the bottom of 304. Since the mixture is the cause of the various matters being predisposed to receive the various forms, what is it that prepared this first matter so that a part of it receives? So you're telling me, Rambam says, that it all started with one matter. That matter, right? But part of that matter became fire, and part of that matter became water, and part of that matter, and so on, right? So what made it happen that way? Why is the matter of earth more fitted for the form of earth, and the matter of fire for the form of fire, right? How did it divide up into these four elements? So Aristotle gave an answer, said, there has been made necessary by the differences between the various places, right? For the part that is depending on where it was. If it was closer to the sphere, right, then it would be kind of like wind or fire, right? And if it's more distant, then it's more like earth, and so on. I'm kind of running through this paragraph, right? Necessary. In other words, based on its location, it took upon itself certain characteristics, and then once it gets mixed by the motion of the sphere, it mixes into have various forms. So then I ask him a question: is the matter of the encompassing sphere? Okay, so all of that's talking about the stuff that's below that sphere. I remember in their physics, in their mind, right? Everything below the moon is this hollow area in which we live in, right? Is this area in which we live and breathe and walk. Once you get above the moon, everything is solid, right? It's these solid spheres made out of matter that are rotating around, right? So within which the planets and the stars are embedded into those solid spheres, right? So are those spheres made up of the same stuff? Now remember, the spheres, according to this physics, Aristotle will have to say no. Why? Because if there was difference, if it was the same stuff, then there's no divider between the sphere and what we find below the sphere, right? Something has to differentiate. Well, it's made out of different stuff. So below the bottom sphere, it's all made out of the same stuff, and which end up being four elements, which ends up getting mixed together into everything we see. For the sphere itself is made up of new stuff. So he says, no, it's another matter, and those are other forms, okay? The term body, right, applied to the bodies that are with us and heavenly bodies is equivocal. In other words, the fact that we talk about bodies, a heavenly body, that's just an equivocal term. Rambam uses that when we use one term to refer to two things that are truly different, but they have some similarities. So the term is borrowed from referring to this to referring to that. From here on, listen. Okay, so this is my conversation with Aristotle. So now Rambam starts talking. So you who are engaged, listen to me. All right, you who are listening, who are learning this treatise. So all of us four people here tonight, and anyone else that listens in the recordings, right? You already know that Aristotle's demonstration that comes from the difference of acts, the difference of forms may be inferred. In other words, how do you know what's a different form? In other words, whether it's fire, water, etc., by what it does, right? So consequently, inasmuch as the motions of the four elements are rectilinear and the motion of the sphere is circular, right? Rectilinear meaning that they don't move in a perfectly circular manner. A perfectly circular manner, Rambam said several times, is a motion which is the only one that keeps on going and going and going. Everything else has a stop and a start. So rectilinear means it's going around in some other shape or form besides a circle, right? Which necessarily is going to crisscross, it's going to end, it's going to, so on. So on the matter of these elements, because we see that everything underneath the sphere of the moon moves around in a rectilinear fashion, right? Remember, they're not thinking that the Earth is moving round and round they're thinking the Earth is stationary, right? So and everything above it is going round and round, right? And this is correct according to natural speculation. It's just what you see, right? So, as you have also found, the elements whose motions are rectilinear differ from one another with regard to direction, right? Some of them going up, some of them down. I just turned to page 306. So, and likewise, it has been found in considering those that move in the same direction, one is more rapid and the other is slower, and so on. And that's how we know, right, that there are four elements, and depending on how they mix, there's different qualities of things going on in this world that we see. If one has recourse to this very kind of inference, it also follows necessarily that the matter of all the heavenly spheres is one, as all of them have circular motion, right? All the heavenly spheres are going around in the same way. So they're all made of the same stuff. Whatever that stuff is, it's the same stuff, right? And that the form of every sphere is different, that even though the matter is the same, the form which they take, right, is a little different, because some of them go from one direction, east to west, other west to east. Some of them go faster, some of them slower. So now I'm going to ask you another question, he says. I'm going to ask this next question to Aristotle. Since the matter in question is common to all the heavenly spheres, right? All the heavenly spheres are made of the same stuff. However, every substratum in them has been particularized as to receive a certain form other than the forms received by the others. Now that in these spheres, each one has a different form, right? They're moving a different way. They have different stars in them, different number of stars, different forms of stars, etc. What made one different from the other, right? Is there beyond the sphere something else, right? What else made this sphere different than that sphere? Is there something else, right, to which this particularization can be attributed except God? What are you going to attribute to? There has to be some other being making that decision, right? Because everything down here is because of the moon sphere that's above it, right? Well, what's above all of those spheres that gives those different qualities to each of those spheres? So now, so in other words, Rambam keeps on asking the question higher and higher and higher. Okay, so as he's going up in the spheres, literally, right? Here I shall call your attention to the depth of Aristotle's penetration. Like, he gives Aristotle a compliment right before he blasts him, right? And he says, his extraordinary apprehension, he was so smart that he realized this problem, right? So, we're on page 306, in the middle of the page, reading the last very long paragraph. And to the extent to which this objection undoubtedly pressed hard upon him, so that he wished to escape from it by recourse to means in which the nature of that which exists did not help him, right? Because over here, right, he couldn't find a rule of physics to explain this, right? So he doesn't really mention this problem, Rambam says, explicitly, but he acknowledges it implicitly. It appears from what he says that he wished to bring order for our benefit into the being of the spheres, just as he brought order of the existence of that was beneath the sphere. In other words, he explained this world really great, but how did he explain those spheres up above there, the upper world thing? So he wished to do this in order that the whole should exist in virtue of natural necessity. He wanted to do this to explain that there are scientific rules that explain those spheres, just as there are scientific rules that explain this one, right? It had to be that way because those are the rules of science. So the whole, he wished, and not in virtue of a purpose of one who purposes according to his will, whatever it be. He did not want to resort to saying that the reason why the spheres are the way they are is because there is a reason. I know that still sounded repetitious, but that's the point. The reason is because there is a reason, because the world had to be this way in order to achieve the result, which is the universe that we live in order that we should result in the lives that you and I are all leading, right? So, and the heavens had to be that way because that's how God decided they should be. Again, this is the teleological argument for God. The world is the way it is, right? We see the world as a place where people are living in the way we're living, and the world is functioning in the way it's functioning, right? And since it could have been in a bazillion other ways, but rather it is in the way we see it, right? How come it's this way? It must be that God made it in order for it to be this way, right? So, for he wished to give but Aristotle didn't want to do that. Aristotle didn't want to say that there was a purpose for it. Aristotle wanted to say it is this way because that's the way it has to be, right? So, for he wished to give a cause for the fact that the sphere moves from the east and not the west. He wished to give a cause for the fact that some of them are swift of motion and others are slow. He wished to give a cause for the fact that every star from among the seven has a number of spheres, while this great number of fixed stars is found in one sphere. He wished to assign causes for all this, so that things would be ordered for us in a natural order that is due to necessity. I just got to the top of 307, right? He wanted it to be, right, that it has to be this way because of the rules of physics. However, he has accomplished none of these undertakings. Aristotle never managed to explain it. As a matter of fact, all he has explained to us regarding what is beneath the sphere of the moon follows in order, conforming to that which exists. Everything he explains about the world we're in today, that we live in and see and breathe and talk and feel and touch in, he explained it. Well, obviously, several years later, a couple hundred years later, we would, after the Rambam, we would disprove all of what he thought he knew. But the Rambam, in his day, they thought they understood the science of everything that they could see. On the other hand, one can say of all he has stated with matters regarding to the sphere that he has assigned no clear cause, and that the matter, as he sets it out, does not follow in order for which necessity can be claimed, right? That whatever that matter is that makes up the heavens, right, doesn't follow the rules, right, that of necessity, because he doesn't never identified them. For we see in case of some spheres, the swifter of motion is above, right? In other words, the rules that we applied to here don't apply there, because here faster things, the slower is above the swifter, and while over here usually swift is above slow or whatever, and so on. And I shall deal with these points in a special chapter of this treatise later in chapter 24. To sum up, right? It was undoubtedly when Aristotle realized the feebleness. I'm going to sum up what the Rambam sums up in a minute, okay? But let's just see what he says, right? It was undoubtedly in the middle paragraph of 307. It was undoubtedly when Aristotle realized the feebleness of what he said in setting forth, right, and expanding the ground and the causes of these things, that he prefaces starting upon these investigations with a statement that runs literally as follows. And this is the Rambam's quote. Pines on the bottom brings other quotes from different translations, but it's, roughly Rambam's translation is roughly corresponds to everybody else's translation of Aristotle. So he says like this: now we desire to make a sufficient inquiry, and it's worth trying to hear carefully what Aristotle's doing and what the point that Rambam is trying to make. To make a sufficient inquiry into two questions, right? I want to ask about two things. Aristotle says it's obligatory for us, right, to inquire into them. We need to ask them and to speak concerning them according to the capacity of our intellects, our knowledge, and our opinion. However, no one ought to attribute this undertaking, don't think, to over boldness or temerity, we're haughty, but rather should our desire and ardor for philosophy be admired. It's a good thing to be curious. Don't think that it's haughty to look into these deep questions. It's not. It's important. It means that you want to learn, right? When therefore we seek out noble and important questions and are able to propound for them, though it be only to some small extent a well-founded solution, it behooves the hearer to feel great joy and jubilation, right? So if we seek out important questions, and then even though only sometimes we actually find answers, the tremendous amount of joy that we feel when we find a good answer makes it worth the whole thing. This is literally what he says. So in other words, Aristotle is admitting up front, right, that we don't really know the answers to all the questions. Okay, so what the Rambam is saying is that ultimately, right, Aristotle, who he viewed in his time as the pinnacle of science, right, was admitting that we have no idea what's going on in the heavens and why it works the way it works, right? And it just does the way it does. Okay, so that's the point. And Billy, I see that you came now, but if you look on page 303, right, he said the last paragraph, which says, "My purpose in this chapter is to explain to you by means of arguments that come close to being a demonstration," right? So the Rambam is telling us up front that all of the arguments that he's going to make to prove that there is a creator and a creation only come close to being a proof. A demonstration in Rambam's language is a proof, right? They don't actually prove anything. I mean, they indicate and they come close, but they're not an actual demonstration. So now, and because the Rambam is about to use that came up in the last two lectures, right? The Rambam is admitting that I'm going to give you an argument that might sound really good, but I understand that it's not an actual proof, right? This is, okay. So it has thus become clear to you, I'm at the bottom of 307, that he was indubitably aware of the feebleness of those assertions. He knew that he had some weaknesses in his argument, and all the more so since the science of mathematics had not been perfected in his time, and since the motions of the sphere were not known in his time to the extent to which we know them today. This is fascinating here. So the Rambam is clearly saying that he understands the advancement of scientific knowledge, right? Now we know a lot more about astronomy than Aristotle did, and now we know a lot more about mathematics than Aristotle did. So in particular, and we still don't know or understand what's going on with the heavens, right? So it appears to me that his assertion in the metaphysics that a separate intellect should be supposed for every sphere, right? In order, namely, in order that there should be something that would particularize every sphere by means of some motion. In other words, the way he explained it, right? He's tried to say that each one has a different intellect, right? That decides how it goes, right? We shall explain later on that he gains nothing by this. It doesn't help. It still leaves too many open questions. With regard to his saying in the text that I've set out for you, according to the capacity of our intellects, our knowledge, and our opinion, I shall explain to you the meaning of this, a meaning that I have not seen set forth by any of the commentators. When saying our opinion, he means the opinion that the eternity of the world, that it was never created. When he says our knowledge, he means that he has in mind the generally accepted point that each of those things has a cause and a ground. Okay. When he says our intellects, he's referring to in our incapacity to assign causes for things of such perfection and accomplishment. For a statement regarding the rapidity of universal motion and the slowness, right? Because, right, he has recourse to a strange and bizarre cause. I can get into that. Similarly, he says that the distance of a sphere from the eighth sphere is greater. However, this is not consistently so because nowadays we've proved it wrong. It's not worth going into that because this is archaic science that has long since been debunked. Right? There is something even more striking, namely that spheres beneath eighth move from east to west. Again, I'm gonna bumble over this a little bit. And it's not just me. Almost every commentator on this says, this stuff is long under the bridge. It's not worth really talking about this debate here. However, right, know that on the basis of the bottom line of all of this is as follows, okay? That the Rambam laid out Aristotelian physics with the spheres and all that stuff. And he said that when you talk about everything on this world, it all makes sense. We got it all. It's all worked out. It has the four elements, how they mix, how they do. Fine. It's all good. Right. But what about the heavens? They're made out of different matter. So then if they're made out of, but it's all the same matter, why does this one look like that? Why does this one go spin like this? Why does this spin like that? Why does this one have 100 billion stars and this one have only 10 billion stars? Why does this one have a star cluster here and there and this one has only 2 stars scattered here and there? Like, so now on the basis of our opinion, the opinion of the community of those who affirm the production of the world in time, all this becomes easy, right? For we say there is a being that has everything has its quality because God decided that I wanted to build a world with these particular qualities, right? So each thing is different, just as it willed every sphere in regard to its motion and rapidity. We do not know in what respect there is wisdom in making these things exist in this fashion. We might not know God's reasons for making these decisions. So this is in part one of the Rambam is touching on one of the arguments for God that still bounces around today, and that but it somewhat sounds a little bit like what people call God of the gaps, like which is when science gets to a point where we don't know the answer, right? So then we say, well, it must be because God wanted it that way. But it's not. It sounds a lot like that, and Rambam is a little touching on that. It's one of the weakest arguments for God out there for a whole host of reasons, which I'm not going to get into right now. But although he is touching on it, he's not really saying that. What he's really saying is that we see a world with a tremendous amount of particularization, right? The same matter, the same stuff, the same rules. And this is still true today, right? I mean, the stars, ultimately everything boils down to, protons, electrons, or even the subatomic particles, right? Smaller than those, right? But ultimately, everything breaks down to certain things. But it could have, so many different things could have happened and resulted in so many different ways. But what we have is a world where each and every piece of the universe is a certain way and has a certain quality, and it is a certain thing about it, right? So, and it could have been, and if all of those things didn't intertwine properly and they didn't exist exactly the way they were, we probably wouldn't be here, right? We wouldn't be having this class and discussion, right? So the fact that the whole universe resulted in what we see and not in any other myriad of a bazillion different ways indicates, but does not prove. Remember, Rambam says from the beginning that I know this doesn't prove it, right? But it indicates that there probably was somebody, God, who wanted to make a world like this. And that's why he made all of these particulars the way he did. Okay. Now, Rambam understands it's not a proof. And why? Why wouldn't it be a proof? And this was a well known thing in the debate circles of the Rambam's days. It's because there were already people then talking about, well, maybe there are infinite worlds, right? But maybe a bazillion of them self-destructed because they didn't work, right? This is just the one that worked, and that's why we're here. Or maybe we don't see all the other ones. Or maybe there's a 1 in 100 bazillion trillion chance that a world will exist exactly like this one does. And it just so happens to be that that's what happened, right? Like somebody's going to win the lottery. The guy that wins the lottery, right, walks around, he got only a 1 in a billion chance, but he's the one, right? So we just happen to, so it doesn't prove it, right? But it does make you think, right? Like, that there must have been a reason for it to be this way. It makes you think there probably is. Now, there's a lot more to talk about in these arguments. These are debated all the time between atheists and non-atheists. But this is what Rambam is presenting here at this point. Now, if Aristotle had been able, as he thought, to give us the cause for the differences between the motions of the spheres, so that these should be in accordance on top of 309 with the order of the positions of the spheres with regard to one another, this would have been extraordinary. In that case, the cause of particularization would have been constituted by the difference between the motions of the spheres, right? In other words, he may have been able to, right, explain it to us, but he couldn't. However, things are not ordered thus, as I've explained to you. Now, you and I know that later on, we started to explain the cause for the spheres. Eventually, they realized that they had it all wrong, and there was no such thing as spheres. It's just outer space. But the rule. But even today, we get higher and higher and deeper and deeper and more focused on the cause of this and the cause of that. But we still have more to go, right? So we got up to here. Now, why does that work that way? And so on. And got up to here. Well, why does that work that way? If you ever get to a point where you have to say, well, this is it. It is this way because it is, right? Because this is just the scientific rule that answers it all, right? The grand unified theory. That's when you'll have proven Aristotle right? But if we keep on going and everything, well, but why is that way? And you keep on asking the question, but why is that, et cetera, then you've proven Rambam right. Because at some point, right, if it has to be a certain way, then we have to eventually find that rule, right? And the Rambam is saying that no matter how high you go, and in his day that was Aristotle, right, you end up not being able to explain the spheres. Nowadays, you and I will say we can't explain, I don't know, whatever it is that science is up to now, right? So that would be the difference. And then you'd have to say, well, that it must be, it was made that way by God. Or not it must be, but probably it was made that way because God wanted it to be that way, because the end result of that rule is the world that you and I live in today. Now, if you really want to hear this out, I very highly recommend that podcast, Physics to God. It's 8 podcasts. It's called Physics to God, and I highly recommend it because these guys have an incredible understanding of modern physics and of modern theology, and it's becoming increasingly clear in the world of physics, right? And this is just fascinating that the world runs based on a certain number of constants. I think it's 20 something constants, right? That the entire universe is based on certain mathematical numbers, like the strength of gravity is, and you fill in the blank, and that's just the way it is. And all these 27, we seem to be very close to being at the place, right? The fundamental search for the grand unified theory, which was in the 20th century the holy grail of physics, is almost being abandoned, or maybe has been abandoned in modern theoretical physics, because we've gotten to the point where it isn't a grand unified theory. It's a set of rules, and it's a set of constants. I think it's 27 different constants, right? And there's no clear reason why they have to be that way. So we may actually almost be, or may actually be at that point of science today where we've reached the end, right? This is it. These are the constants. These are the numbers. That's what the world is based on. Why are the constants the way they are? We don't know. I highly recommend this podcast because they go through this point.
Can you put it on the chat so we can copy it and paste it so we can get emails on it? Because
I'll write down what it's called. They have it's called Physics to God. I'll try to get a link.
So if I go into Google and I put physics to God, will I get it?
Physics to God podcast. You'll probably find it.
And I can just put that into the Google.
It comes right up, and the one that says podcast just goes to a picture. But if you go on the top thing, it says Physics to God, and it gets you right to the podcast.
Yeah. So these guys put there's going to be 3 series. The first series they put out, it's 1 to 8, and I don't know what they're going to say in series 2. They're waiting for another year. I think the next one is going to come out like in April or May of 2024. They're going to do another series of 8, and then they're going to do a third series of 8, and I'm guessing in 2025. I mean, I asked
10 here.
Say that again. Okay, 10. So, but that's still the season 1, right?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure I listened to the first season, and I asked the guys about the next season. They said it's not coming out until like April or May.
And they refused it. Are they physicists or who are these guys?
They do have and educate the appropriate credentials, but listen to, they'll tell you all their credentials on there. Okay. They both have a rabbinic ordination, I think, but they both also have academic credentials. But they describe themselves very well in there. And then I don't know what they're going to say the next season. I'm sitting at the edge of my seat. But even in the first season, it's very highly worthwhile, because if it's true that what they're positing in there, and that is, it's they're basing this on the state of current modern physics today, if it ends up that we end up with 10 rules, right, or 12 rules, or I think it's 27. Please don't quote me on that. Constants. And that's the rules that govern the whole universe. Now what? Right? Right? What? So, okay, so why is this the rule? If it's 0.9672347 meters squared, why isn't it 0.962378 meters squared, right? Right? Why? If it was a little bit different, nothing would exist, right? Right? The world would not exist, right? So,
yeah, the one we know.
Yeah, right. So why is it this way? So now it could be just chance, right? But the chance of it happening is so minuscule that one would then tell himself, it seems much more probable to say that someone made these constants this way in order that we should have a world like this, right? And now, if that is exactly what Rambam is saying, right? Now, Rambam is using language that doesn't refer to constants, and they didn't even know what gravity was, right? But let alone what the mathematical formula is to figure it out, right?
Can I ask this question? Why is that any different from what a rabbi told my son many years ago at Charles Smith? If you look at a car, it's true, you could take a bunch of pieces of metal and screws and stuff and drop it from a plane. And maybe when it lands on the earth, you get a car, but it's highly unlikely. So this is the proof of God, because there are cars and it's not by random. Is that any different from what you're saying here?
It's similar in many ways. That's the argument from complexity, right? Which is very similar and very closely related to the argument from teleology, right? So the teleological argument makes the argument that if we have a world that looks like this, which is basically saying it's so complex, it had to be so complex in order to create what we see, right? There must have been somebody who sat down and said, this is what I want to make. Right. So it is, to a large degree, that same argument. The only difference is in that Rambam is very willing to keep searching, right? In other words, he says, first of all, he understands, he said off the bat, the first sentence was that it comes close to a proof, right? Because it's still possible that a car, like you said, just happened, right? Right. So it doesn't prove it. Right. This is very important. The Rambam is extremely humble in his assertions. I get that it doesn't prove it, because somebody can still come along and say, well, if there's a 1 in a bazillion trillion chance, well, it happened, right? Right. So and the other thing is that I'm sorry, you can also infer from purpose, right? If we live in a world and we feel that there's a sense of purpose, there must be a sense of purpose. We go, right? We're all searching for purpose. It's like it's built into the world that there's a reason why we're here, So, but that wasn't the point that I wanted to make. The point that I want to make was Rambam is not telling us not to keep searching, right? In other words, he asks those questions of Aristotle, right? Of the science that he looks up to. He doesn't say we shouldn't try to figure out what the nature of the heavens are. The Rambam himself said, right, now we're learning more about astronomy than Aristotle knew, right? So he doesn't say that we should sit back and say, oh, the world is the way it is because that's the way God wants it. So he's doing, why bother studying science, right? Right? Rather, the Rambam is saying we need to keep doing this search because mathematics advances, right? Astronomy advances, and nowadays every other body of science advances, right? We should constantly keep looking more and more and more and more and more, right? And even though, in theory, that might lead to you concluding that Aristotle is right, right? Because if we keep on going and going and going and going, right, and we find out how just everything is the way it is because it has to be the one law that states that this is how it has to be, then you've just proven that God doesn't exist. And the Rambam's not afraid of that, right? He's telling you, no, keep looking, right? And Rambam is telling you now, when I look at this, I end here at the sphere of the moon. After that, it doesn't make sense anymore, right? You and I might end somewhere else because we're 1,000 years later, right? But anyway, but it is the same kind of argument, and there's that argument's been debated back and forth over the years, and one of the answers to the argument, like Darwin was one of the guys who really wrote against that argument because he explained the complexity of life. Like people said, why is there hundreds of millions of different species of animals and each one is a little bit different than the other one? It's so complicated, so complex, they're so different, it has to be God designed it. The same thing like the car argument, right? And Darwin said, no, I'll tell you how it happens, right? The mosquito, this bird is yellow because there's yellow flowers on this island. And if the birds that were red got eaten by the eagle, right? And this one is green because they have a lot of green grass, so on and so forth, right? And it evolved. So he explained it, right? Which is good, which is great. But okay, but let's keep going and let's keep going and let's keep going. Let's see where all this knowledge leads us to. And the Rambam is saying you're eventually going to get to the point where it's still going to be incredibly amazing, incredibly wonderful, incredibly complicated, right? But there won't be a reason anymore, right? And you're going to have to say, well, either it's just random, right, which is a crazy chance, or it happened because God willed it that way, because God wanted the result that we see in front of us today, right? So anyway, so a fact which makes it's a long chapter, and I was hoping to finish it today, but we're almost done with an hour.
Can I ask what does it mean to say God willed it? I don't know. I heard the words. I don't understand it.
You shouldn't understand it. It's good that you don't understand it. Because remember, Rambam said many times, right? When we say God willed it, it's simply our way of describing, right? Obviously, God doesn't have a will. He doesn't have a right. But for whatever it is that God does, which we'll never be able to understand or explain, right? The world came about because God willed it that way, right? And I'm using the English word willed because I'm a human being and I could only describe things and concepts that human beings can grasp, right?
And that by definition, you're unable to express it or understand it. So you're just using just a random combination of letters and sounds is what
exactly, right. There's a lot left this chapter, but it's going to be similar. The second half is going to be similar to this, but we have to stop here because I can't hold it. It's hard to we can't keep on going, but I do have a few more minutes for more comments and questions.
I won't comment because I've just convinced myself that it's a random collection of sounds and letters that are emerging from this exchange.
Right, right. Yeah, it doesn't actually mean anything. Um. So yeah, I mean, this is it's gonna be interesting. It's gonna be fun. I mean, I hope it already is. We have to plug through a whole bunch of chapters. You know, all this section is all about these kinds of philosophical arguments that go on to this day. I keep trying as hard as I can to bring it back to our century because and I know that it's fraught with some mistakes when you do that because our science is so different that I don't know if Rambam would have said exactly what I'm saying here. He's saying, you know, but I'm trying my best to show how these ideas are relevant, even are very relevant today, even if you take out all of the business about spheres and the matter that they're made of and all that stuff, which we know today is completely wrong. And nowadays, where we do know a lot about what goes on above what Rambam would call the sphere of the moon, right? Underneath the sphere of the moon is Rambam's equivalent of saying what's on this earth that you and I know, right? Now, we two things. First of all, we do know a lot more about the world above the moon, right? The universe, because we have instruments. We even went there, right? But we have instruments that can measure it. And we also know that the world that Rambam thought he knew, he didn't even have an inkling of what it was, right? Of the different kinds of species and how and the incredible amount of knowledge we've learned about the biology of the world we are in, below the moon. But it's still relevant. It's still important, you know, and we could still learn from these things for today. So that's I'm trying to emphasize that. If there's no more comments or questions, is there anyone?
So,
Yeah,
so
please.
Rambam would not have believed in like the statement of the heavens. It happened in the heavens. What, and
Absolutely
separated.
not. Right. Yeah. The Rambam said, I think it was last week, he even said a quote, right? The idea that, you know, God dwells in the heavens just means that when we look to the heavens, right, we see things that help indicate to us that God exists, right? And Rama is going to say soon, we didn't get to it this week, but we'll say it next week, right? That we look to the heavens, we see these proofs because when we look to the heavens, what do we see? We see so many things that we can't explain, right? Right? We see, I don't understand. Why is this sphere different from that sphere? Why is this matter go this way and the other matter goes that way? If they're the same matter, all these questions, right? So when we look to the skies and the stars, we start to think there must be a purpose. There must be a God who made it for a purpose. So that's why we say we look to the heavens and we see God, not because God's there, right?
Right.
But nowadays, you and I would use the language a little differently. We look to the heavens and we see just how vast and how incredibly wondrous the universe is, right? And we're just so impressed with the complexity of and the beauty and the grandeur of what we see that we start to tell ourselves, well, this either happened because it's just randomly those 27 constants happen to actually be exactly this number, just happened to be that way, or no, those constants are that way because God wanted to make a world and a universe like this. So yeah, but God himself isn't in the heavens in any way, shape, or form, right? He isn't in any particular place. Does that answer what you asked?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. And Rama did say that last week. I think it was maybe it was 2 weeks ago. I feel like the Rambam's talking to us every week.
Maybe.
Yeah, one of my sons in Israel now. He went with his school on a trip to the Rambam's grave. One of the few they're only letting them go on trips to places they feel are safe. You know, luckily as the situation improves, they can go more places around and stuff. And he gave a whole speech about praying and asking a tzaddik, asking a righteous person to pray before God. And my son, having learned a little bit of Maimonides with me, he calls me and says, like, the Rambam would have, would probably rolling in his grave listening to somebody saying things like that. And I was saying, I'm surprised the Rambam didn't climb out of his grave and tell this guy to just stop. But anyway, I'm not saying that there isn't a legitimate stream of Judaism that believes and teaches such things, and that's fine. But it wasn't the Rambam, you know. Anyway, so yeah, any other comments?
Will you have class next week?
Wait, what's next week? Oh, next week is the night before Thanksgiving, right?
Right.
So no, I'm going to be flying to New York to be there with my parents and my sister. So I'll be flying Wednesday night. So yeah, not next week, the week after.
Okay. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you. So 1 week off. All right, take care. Bye-bye. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.